Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 100th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'll try to tackle a topic that I've always had trouble wrapping my head around, and I've already kind of addressed it, but it was in a messy way. Um, it's the topic of everything happening now, quote unquote, and this idea of things happening simultaneously across different timelines, across different incarnations, so to speak, past and future happening at once. And I'll try to clarify how that works with a nice little visual that I came up with. So let's get right to it. First thing is we're going to come back to one of the concepts that I've developed in previous videos. That is that the universe or time expands simultaneously in all directions, much like a bubble, where as you start from a point in the center and then you expand, take that out. You expand outwards simultaneously in all directions. And so time sort of stretches in all directions simultaneously. But then inside that time, let's put different points here. Let's say these different points are the start of one incarnation. And I'm going to use different colors so that it's clear. Green and red sticks out pretty well. There. So you have the green dots and the red dots represent birth, and the end of the line represents your life, and of course the end of the line is when you die or disincarnate. And so now just imagine, so this is quote unquote the past if time flows in that direction. Put linear time here. Perception. Linear time perception. And this would be the future. Now, let's imagine that at every point here, there is a moment of the now, quote unquote now, in the middle of the life. That is the now. There. And these points are now experienced simultaneously. So these little points are the now, this eternal present. And what's interesting is this is how it kind of works. So let's just imagine that each one of these is living a specific emotion. For instance, your future self here is living an emotion of joy. Now, emotions is what is instantaneous because it's, energy in motion, it's vibrations. And so when you feel an emotion, there is a phenomenon of resonance and harmonics. Harmonics and resonance, which is instantaneous. That is, if on a piano, for instance, you play one key, so better drawing, you play one note, and you keep the pedal sort of pressed, all of the other notes that are in resonance with that one will start playing as well, will start vibrating. And so if your future self feels joy, then that will reverberate into all of the times in other timelines where that emotion was felt. And so from that now moment of yourself in the future, that actually sort of quote unquote activates or sends energy um, to all of the other times into the past and into the future as well, of course, where that same emotion was felt. Because it's the same vibration. It's just that it can be higher or lower depending on the level of consciousness. Just like on the piano, you have lower frequencies and higher frequencies. But it's essentially the same. And now imagine if someone else in the past is experiencing a different emotion. Like, for instance, this one is experiencing sadness. The same phenomenon happens where, let me use a different color maybe, there, where from that eternal now, that emotion also sort of activates and resonates with different points in time where that same emotion was felt. And that can actually be also in your own lifetime, because you experience sadness in many different times in your life. And so you see that from just a few eternal nows in time, it actually activates all of the other nows. Because imagine how many incarnations you have, quote unquote, because they're not reincarnations, they're incarnations, the manifestation of that one same thing. And imagine how many different emotions you can feel, your other selves feel in this eternal now. They might be completely different from the one that you're feeling. And that emotion activates other points in your life. And so it doesn't really matter whether you take one point from the now arbitrarily and you say, well, that's the now, and try to figure out what other things are happening. Because if you take a now a little bit later, it'll be exactly the same thing. They will also feel a different emotion from the one that they felt before, and they'll just activate different points or different versions of you that are feeling the same or the same kind of emotion. And so when I'm saying, in my previous videos, I typically say everything creates everything else into existence. And that is kind of how this works, is that from each point of the now, the emotions that you're feeling, what you're doing, reverberates across all of your incarnations in a resonance or harmonics kind of fashion instantaneously. And that sort of feeds or breathes life into those other versions of you that are feeling that same emotion, and vice versa, because you don't really know which one is the originator, because anyone can be the originator. And you could say that, for instance, from the perspective of this now, this one was also feeling joy, and it's very difficult to know which one activated or is at the root of the activation of the other one. It's this idea of interdependent origination in Buddhism. So now this is, of course, a gross simplification because I'm using a 2D circle. Imagine this in 3 dimensions, where you have an extremely sophisticated sort of pattern or network of all kinds of different incarnations, because ultimately we're talking about reincarnation as if you have this one soul and it splits into plenty of different branches. But ultimately, since there's only one single soul, that is God or the universal consciousness, it doesn't really matter what you name it, then this idea of incarnations and finding out which incarnation you are, or which past or future lives you have, is just a matter of looking inside, like it's like a branch, a tree, and you're on one of those branches, and there are plenty of leaves on those branches, and you are one of those leaves, and then you consider that only the other leaves on that same branch are your incarnations. But why would that be limited to the leaves on that branch? Maybe you could say that your past incarnations and future incarnations are also the leaves on a neighboring branch. Why would you say that that's the cutoff here? It's arbitrary. Ultimately, every single leaf on that tree is yourself. It's just a matter of the relative distance and relative separation between you, your soul, or your splinter, or your spark, your magical spark of life, or whatever, um, from the other ones. And so, maybe emotions, basically, you can have emotions tied that are span across this whole thing in a manner that is extremely difficult to understand. Just like the links in between the neurons in your brain, and the links in the neural network that they form is extremely complex. And an activation in one part of your brain can activate another part of your brain, seemingly even though they're seemingly unrelated. And sometimes, those connections are going to be direct, much closer. Sometimes they're going to be like this, like completely um, very distant. And there's a logic to it, but it's a logic that is typically beyond our understanding. And the same is valid for this whole idea of how this everything happening now kind of works. As you can see, I mean, you can take any point in a person's incarnation, and any point in a person's incarnation is the it's like any moment in the now is basically the center, because regardless of whether you take this point in the now, or if you go a little further down and there's a different emotion that you're experiencing, it's everything would still create everything else. It's just that you take a different starting point for this whole process. And so the expansion of time in all directions is more like a gigantic um, emotional symphony. And the whole idea is, of course, gradually reaching harmony. Um, Harmony between all of these sort of emotions. And the reason why many spiritual teachers are insisting about, being able to deal with your emotions, like, Eckhart Tolle, and all kinds of other ones that are saying, we need to let the emotions flow through us and not having resistance, is because ultimately that's virtually all that there is to do, really, from the point of view of the universal consciousness. And our mental structure, or our mind, our ideas, is just a tool at the service of this emotional harmony. It is just a tool for sorting out those emotions and being able to experience them in a harmonious way. Because if you just have pure emotions, it's very difficult still to navigate the world, because you don't have any mental structure. And so you cannot put words or you cannot make very complex interactions, for instance, of knowing what to do or how to harmonize them. Giving you an example, for instance, when you have an animal that senses an earthquake, all it gets is raw, pure information in the form of like fear or something like that, to leave the area. But a human being can translate that impulse, that information, into information that is much more complex. Like, for instance, there's going to be an earthquake there, here, this is what you can do, this is how you can prepare. And so what we're doing is just constructing this very complex mental model or structure for experiencing emotions in a harmonious way. That is at least what I think from at this moment, at least, from the model that I've developed. And so again, imagine this in 3 dimensions, and imagine that this is just one tiny little overview of how this happens. And you have on a sphere, you have all kinds of networks and links between different lives, incarnations, and again, like, you have a point in this eternal now, and any point in this eternal now can be deemed the center, because regardless of what happens, it activates all the other points. So I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But yeah, I think like the most important point is this idea of resonance and harmonics, vibrations, and emotions and emotional harmony. And so as you expand out, the symphony becomes much more complex. That is, reaching balance, reaching harmony between all of the emotions felt is much more complicated, but you get to construct a reality which is much more complex, and experience that is much more complex as well. With 9 billion humans, for instance, 9 billion humanoid beings, the emotional harmony that can be created, and therefore the navigation inside infinity, all that can be experienced within infinity, is much, much richer. It's the same with basically like a piano keyboard. If you have a piano keyboard with just, let's say, 12 keys, there's only so many things that you can do with 12 keys. But imagine if you expand that to 88 keys, which is the standard on pianos, then the kind of music you can play becomes infinitely more rich. And the more keys you add, of course, the more complex the music gets, but also the harder it is to achieve harmony, and the more difficult it is. And this is it's the same with these emotions. And so maybe this is another way to also revisit karma. Karma is not necessarily punishment. It's more, how should I say it? It's more like the outward manifestation of the emotional harmony that you are in charge of. So the things that are happening in your life is like the universe saying, I'm going to give you, for instance, in this lifetime, right now, the universe is playing this symphony, and there's an emotional imbalance created by everyone at the same time, basically, anyways. And how about you take care of a slice of that dissonance or that disharmony and try to bring it back into balance by dealing with your emotions, for instance, coloring your emotion in a particular way, which solves a problem of, an imbalance or some kind of, problem here. For instance, if when this one experiences joy, if someone in a past lifetime, for instance, here, that was supposed to resonate with that joy, has trauma, which blocks the emotion of joy because they're depressed or whatever, then it sort of diminishes the balance, or the resonance, blocks the resonance and harmonics for all of the other ones. And so that's also how you can help, how the universe basically helps itself from every single point in time simultaneously. Because if you deal with your emotions from any eternal now, or the now that you experience in an hour or later, it will reverberate across all your timelines regardless. And so you get an eternal occasion, an eternal opportunity every minute, every second of the now to um, bring into balance um, this entire sort of thing. And it's a team effort, of course, but still, I mean, you don't need anyone's permission to play your part, um, and you get an infinite amount of tries from any moment in the now. You can do that, and I would say that people like the Buddha, I don't know if I spelled that correctly, anyways, or Jesus or whatever, are individuals that manage to bring their state of being into such a state of emotional balance that they basically jumped to a higher kind of level on this circle, where you see this from the outside as a being that is composed of human beings as cells. So it's as if, there are these spheres within spheres within spheres, and they're comprised of networks of um, not really beings, but points of consciousness which have a certain level of maturity. And you have like the network of cells, for instance. And if they bring their behavior towards each other into harmony, then they can jump, their consciousness can jump to the perception of human beings. And if they bring their emotional state into a harmonious state, of course, it's not just emotions, it's a whole, like your mental state, your emotional state, all of those different layers of yourself, or aspects of yourself, have to be working in a coordinated and harmonious fashion. Then you jump towards the next sphere, which is the sphere of a conscious universe, which we would call like Buddha, or a conscious solar system or planet, which we would say is Jesus. It doesn't really matter. It all depends on how much mastery you've gained over all of these aspects of your being. And so it's almost like you've sort of proved that you are capable of playing, quote unquote, with the human keyboard, the human piano, say the human piano, um, in a harmonious way. And once you've mastered that human keyboard, you can move on to the next keyboard. So you've managed to master all of the emotions. You know how to play them. You know how they interact with each other. You're not fixated on one or the other. You don't have an imbalance in terms of your emotional state. And then you can move on to the next one. And of course, it's all a whole. It's not just emotions, it's also your mental structure. It's everything. Um, so, again, I hope this was clear. Sorry about the ranting. I always have like new things and ideas that pop into my mind. So, um, yeah, so talk to you next time. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.